He woke up before the sun, just like every other day. The alarm clock buzzed on the small wooden table beside his bed, and he quickly turned it off before it disturbed his little girl, still curled up under her blanket. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, rubbing his tired eyes. Another long day was waiting, but he couldn't let himself slow down. His daughter was all he had left. Since the day his wife passed away, his life had changed completely. He had promised himself that no matter how difficult things got, he would give his little girl a life filled with love, warmth, and safety. He was a father and a mother at the same time now. That thought kept him moving every single morning. The apartment they lived in wasn't big. It was just a small two-room place in an old building, with walls that carried years of wear. But to him, it was home because his daughter's laughter filled those rooms. Before heading to work, he always made breakfast, sometimes eggs, sometimes bread and butter, and on days when he had a little extra money, he would buy fruits for her. He knew she loved apples, and he often saved coins in a jar just so he could surprise her. That morning, he quietly walked into the kitchen. He sliced bread and spread some jam on it. He boiled water for tea for himself and milk for her. The little girl woke up to the smell of food and came out rubbing her sleepy eyes. She sat at the small table and smiled. "Papa, are you going to work again early today?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said, putting the plate in front of her. "But I'll be back before you sleep, I promise." She nodded and began eating. He looked at her, his heart full. She was the reason he pushed through all the struggles. Every time he thought he couldn't keep going, her smile reminded him that he had to. By the time he dropped her at school and made his way to the company, the city was already alive. Cars honked, people rushed, and tall buildings cast shadows on the busy streets. He worked at a large firm, one of the biggest in the city. For years, he had been part of the team that managed accounts and paperwork. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't high-paying, but it was steady. And steady meant food on the table and rent paid on time. But in the eyes of his boss, things weren't that simple. She was a woman of power, known for her sharp decisions and ambition. To her, business always came first. Personal struggles, family issues, or human feelings had no place in her world. And though he worked hard, she often looked at him as if his responsibilities as a single father made him weak. That day at the office, he sat quietly at his desk, working through piles of files. Numbers and reports filled the screen in front of him. His coworkers often admired him for his dedication. They had seen him rush out during lunch breaks to attend a school meeting, then return and stay late to finish his work. They respected how he balanced both roles, but they also noticed how the CEO seemed to grow colder toward him with each passing week. Sometimes whispers floated in the corridors about how she had a secret from her past that she would do anything to keep hidden. But he never paid attention to such talk. He believed in minding his own business. He wasn't there to gossip. He was there to work, to earn, and to take care of his daughter. Still, life wasn't easy. There were days when the bills piled up faster than his paychecks. There were nights when he stayed awake, worrying about the future. But no matter how tired he was, he always put on a brave face for his little girl. She deserved a father who smiled at her, not one who carried his burdens on his shoulders in front of her. One evening, as he came home carrying groceries in one hand and his daughter's school bag in the other, a neighbor stopped him. "You're always working so hard," the neighbor said kindly. "Don't you ever take a break?" He smiled faintly. "Breaks are a luxury," he replied. "Right now my daughter is my only priority." And that was true. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every extra hour at work, it was all for her. She was too young to fully understand. But he hoped one day she would know how much her father gave just to see her happy. At night, after finishing homework with her, he tucked her into bed. She looked up at him with sleepy eyes and whispered, "Papa, when I grow up, I want to help you so you don't have to be tired all the time." His heart tightened at her words. He kissed her forehead and said, "You just focus on being a child. That's your only job right now. I'll handle the rest." As he turned off the lights and sat alone in the small living room, he thought about how fragile life was. Everything he had built could disappear in a single moment. One job loss, one bad turn. He prayed silently for strength, not for himself, but for the little girl who depended on him for everything. What he didn't know was that the very job he held onto so tightly would soon be taken away from him. And not because of his mistakes, but because of a secret buried deep in the past of the very woman who signed his paychecks. His life was about to be turned upside down again, in a way he never saw coming. But that night, as he looked through the small window at the stars, he had no idea what was waiting ahead. For now his world was simple. Wake up, work hard, and protect the one person he loved more than his own life. And so, another day ended, with a father holding on to hope, unaware that destiny was already preparing a storm that would test him like never before. She sat in her office on the top floor of the building, staring out of the tall glass windows. The city stretched out before her, lights glowing, cars moving like tiny ants below. From the outside, her life looked perfect. She was the CEO of one of the most successful companies in the city. People respected her. Some even feared her. She had money, power, and influence. But inside, she carried a weight she never spoke of. Behind all the achievements and the polished image was a secret she had hidden for years. It was something from her past that could ruin everything if it ever came out. Sometimes at night, she lay awake, wondering if one day the truth would catch up to her. That fear never left her, no matter how high she climbed in her career. At the office, she wore a mask of confidence. She was known for her sharp voice and quick decisions. Employees avoided making mistakes around her because they knew she had no patience for weakness. To her, business wasn't about kindness or emotions. It was about results. Still, there was one employee she couldn't stop noticing: the single father. He was hardworking, always punctual, and despite his personal struggles, his work was neat and accurate. But she didn't see dedication when she looked at him. She saw risk. His quiet nature, his determination, and the way other workers admired him made her uneasy. In her mind, he was different from the rest. And sometimes, different meant dangerous. She had overheard a few conversations in the office, people whispering about her past. She never showed it on her face, but every time those whispers reached her, her chest tightened. She couldn't allow anyone to dig into her life, especially someone like him. He was a single parent who had already faced loss, and people like that often had nothing to lose. In her eyes, he could easily become the person who uncovered what she had buried so carefully. One afternoon, as she walked past the open office floor, she saw him at his desk. He was making calls, checking numbers, his face tired but focused. A framed photo of his daughter sat beside his computer. He smiled at it for a second before going back to his work. That small smile struck her in a way she didn't expect. For a moment, she envied him. Not because of his life, it was far from comfortable, but because of the pure love that shone on his face when he thought of his child. It was something she had lost long ago. She quickly shook off the feeling. To her, emotions were distractions, and distractions were weaknesses. Still, the image stayed with her longer than she wanted. Later that day, her assistant came into the office with a folder. "We've had some unusual questions from one of the departments," the assistant said cautiously. "It seems like someone has been asking about some old records connected to your early years with the company." Her stomach dropped, but she didn't show it. She calmly asked, "Who was it?" The assistant hesitated. "We can't be certain yet, but some believe it might have been him." She froze. Him. The single father. The name echoed in her mind like an alarm bell. She didn't even ask why, or what he wanted to know. Fear twisted her thoughts instantly. To her, this wasn't a coincidence. It was a threat. That night, she sat alone in her car, parked in the basement of the building. She closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. Memories from years ago came rushing back. The choices she had made, the mistakes she had hidden. She had built her success on burying that part of her life, and she wasn't going to let anyone dig it up now. But the fear wasn't just about losing her position. It was about losing the life she had worked so hard to create. She had made sacrifices, some she regretted, but she convinced herself they were necessary. "Survival comes before everything," she whispered to herself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The next morning, She watched him from her glass office as he walked into work, carrying a worn briefcase and a tired look on his face. He greeted the security guard with a small smile, then headed to his desk. She could see the weight on his shoulders, but she also noticed his determination. It scared her more than she wanted to admit. Her assistant's words rang in her ears. It might have been him. Whether it was true or not didn't matter anymore. In her mind, he was already guilty. She decided right then that she couldn't take the risk of keeping him in the company. Over the next few days, she became colder toward him. Whenever his name came up in meetings, she dismissed it quickly. She even began looking through his records, searching for reasons to justify what she was planning. She told herself it was business, nothing personal. But deep down, it was fear that was guiding her. One evening, she sat at her desk long after everyone else had left. The office was quiet, the city lights glowing through the window. She pulled out a file with his name on it. As she flipped through the papers, she saw nothing unusual, just a record of steady, reliable work. Nothing that justified suspicion. But her fear overpowered logic. She whispered to herself, "I can't let him stay. If he knows anything, it could destroy me." And so, the decision was made. The man who worked tirelessly to support his little girl, the man who stayed late to finish tasks, the man who asked for nothing but the chance to provide for his child. He was about to lose it all. Not because of failure, but because of a past that wasn't even his. She leaned back in her chair, closing the file. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had convinced herself this was the only way. Tomorrow, she would summon him to her office. Tomorrow, she would end his career in the company. What she didn't know was that destiny had other plans. The man she saw as a threat would soon become the very person who would save the one life she loved most in the world. The morning sun lit up the tall glass walls of the company's headquarters. Employees rushed in through the revolving doors, carrying coffee cups and laptops, preparing for another busy day. Among them was the single father, moving at his usual steady pace. His mind was already racing with numbers, reports, and the long list of tasks he had to finish before the day was over. But beneath that calm, steady walk, his thoughts were somewhere else. Rent was due soon, and his daughter's school had sent home a letter about a small trip that required payment. He wanted her to go, to have those memories with her classmates. But looking at his paycheck and the bills piling up, he didn't know how to make it all work. Still, as always, he reminded himself, one step at a time. When he reached his desk, he greeted a coworker with a polite smile. His daughter's photo sat by his computer, as it always did. That small picture was his motivation. He sat down and began typing, focused, determined to give his best. But just a few floors above, in the corner office, a decision had already been made about him. The CEO had spent days convincing herself that letting him go was the only choice. She told herself it was business, that leaders had to make tough calls. But deep inside, it wasn't about performance, it was about fear. Fear that he might expose the past she had buried. By mid-morning, her assistant appeared at his desk. "The CEO would like to see you in her office," the assistant said softly, almost avoiding eye contact. He froze for a moment. Being called to the CEO's office wasn't something that happened often, especially to someone like him. He quickly saved his work, straightened his shirt, and followed the assistant upstairs. As he walked through the polished hallway, his heart beat faster. He had always worked hard, never broken rules. Why was he being called? When he stepped inside her office, he felt the difference immediately. The air was colder, heavier. The CEO sat behind her large desk, her expression unreadable. She didn't invite him to sit right away. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment, as if she was trying to read his thoughts. Finally, she spoke. "I'll get straight to the point," she said in a firm voice. "Your performance has not been meeting the standards we expect at this company." His eyes widened in shock. I don't understand," he said carefully. "I've always submitted my work on time. If there's something wrong, I can fix it." She shook her head. "It's not just about deadlines. It's about the bigger picture. We need people who can give 100% to the job. And with your circumstances, I'm not sure you're able to do that." Her words cut deeper than he expected. My circumstances, he repeated quietly, his voice trembling. She didn't flinch. Yes. You have responsibilities outside of work. And while I respect that, the company cannot afford distractions. He felt his chest tighten. He thought of the late nights he had stayed behind to finish reports, the weekends he had sacrificed, the times he had rushed back from his daughter's school only to work twice as hard to catch up. None of it mattered in this moment. So you're firing me, he said slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. The CEO leaned back in her chair, her tone sharp but calm. We're letting you go. Effective immediately. For a few seconds, silence filled the room. He stood frozen, his thoughts spinning. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to tell her how unfair this was. But the words wouldn't come. All he could think about was his daughter's face, the way she smiled when he picked her up from school, the way she trusted him completely. How was he going to tell her he had lost his job? Finally, he whispered, I've given everything I could to this company. His voice cracked, but he forced himself to continue. I've worked late nights, I've never complained, I've never asked for special treatment. And this is what I get. The CEO didn't respond. She simply closed the file in front of her, signaling that the conversation was over. He turned to leave, his heart heavy, his step slow. As he walked back through the office, co-workers looked up from their desks, sensing something was wrong. Some gave him sympathetic glances, others avoided his eyes. He kept his head down, not wanting anyone to see the storm of emotions inside him. When he reached his desk, he quietly began packing his things. The photo of his daughter was the first thing he picked up. He held it for a moment, staring at her bright smile. I'll figure something out, he whispered to himself. His coworkers gathered around him, some offering words of comfort. You didn't deserve this, one of them said softly. Everyone here knows how hard you worked. He nodded, but didn't reply. Words couldn't fix what had just happened. He placed his belongings into a small box and walked out of the building for the last time. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing had happened. People hurried down the sidewalks, cars honked, life moved forward. But for him, everything felt frozen. Each step toward home was heavier than the last. When he finally reached the small apartment, his daughter came running to the door. Papa, she shouted happily, throwing her arms around his legs. He hugged her tightly, holding on longer than usual. How was school? He asked, forcing a smile. It was good, she said cheerfully. We learned a new song today. He listened as she sang a few lines, her little voice filling the room. For a moment, the pain in his chest eased. But then the reality returned. He had no job, no income, and no clear plan for what came next. That night, after she fell asleep, he sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the bills spread out before him. He buried his face in his hands. For years, he had carried the weight of the world for his daughter, but now it felt heavier than ever. And yet, in that moment of despair, he made himself a promise. He would not give up. He had already survived so much. He would find a way through this too. What he didn't know was that the very person who had taken away his job, the CEO who dismissed him so coldly, would soon find herself in a crisis. And when that moment came, it would be him, the man she had cast aside, who would stand as her only hope. The hall was decorated with shining lights, white tablecloths, and flower arrangements on every table. It was the night of the company's charity event, an annual gathering where business leaders, employees, and guests came together to raise funds for community projects. The CEO stood at the center of it all, dressed elegantly, her presence commanding respect. Cameras flashed, people greeted her with admiration, and she smiled gracefully, though her mind was, as always, focused on maintaining her image. Her young daughter was there too, sitting at a table near the stage. She was a sweet, shy child who preferred books and quiet moments to the noise of big events. That evening, she wore a simple dress her mother had chosen, her hair neatly tied back. She watched the guests with curious eyes, occasionally glancing at her mother on stage. The event moved smoothly, speeches were made, donations announced, and applause echoed through the hall. The CEO, while smiling and shaking hands, couldn't help but feel proud of how perfect everything seemed. It was the kind of night that reminded her of the power she held. But beneath the glamorous surface, her daughter wasn't feeling well. She had mentioned to her mother earlier that she felt a little dizzy, but the CEO, caught up in the importance of the event, brushed it off as nerves. "Just sit quietly, darling," she had said gently before stepping onto the stage. Halfway through the evening, as the guests were enjoying dinner, a sudden sound cut through the chatter, a chair scraping against the floor, followed by gasps. The CEO's daughter had slumped forward, her small frame collapsing against the table. The glass she had been holding slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. For a moment, the entire hall froze. Then chaos erupted. Guests rushed to their feet, some calling for help, others backing away in shock. The CEO dropped the microphone mid-sentence and ran toward her child, her heart pounding wildly. "Someone call an ambulance," she shouted, her voice breaking with panic. She lifted her daughter in her arms, tears welling in her eyes. "Please stay with me," she whispered desperately, shaking her gently. But the little girl's face was pale, her breathing shallow. The CEO's hands trembled. For the first time in years, she felt powerless. She had faced boardrooms, competitors, and the toughest challenges of the corporate world without fear. But now, seeing her child's life slipping away, she was nothing but a terrified mother. People crowded around, their voices overlapping in confusion. Some tried to help, but no one knew what to do. Seconds felt like hours. The CEO's vision blurred with tears as she cried, "Please, somebody help her." And then, through the crowd, a figure appeared. It was him, the single father she had dismissed just days before. He had come to the event as a guest, invited by a coworker who respected his years of service. He hadn't planned on staying long, but fate had placed him there at the exact moment he was needed most. When he saw the little girl lying motionless, his instincts took over. He rushed forward, his voice calm but firm. "Give me space. Please step back," he said, pushing through the crowd. The CEO looked up, stunned. Her eyes widened with disbelief. "You," she whispered, almost unable to form the words. "I know first aid," he said quickly, kneeling beside the child. He remembered the training he had taken years ago after his wife's accident. He had promised himself back then that he would always be prepared to protect his daughter. And now, that knowledge was about to save another child's life. He placed the little girl gently on the floor and checked her breathing. Weak, shallow. His heart raced, but his hands remained steady. He began performing CPR, pressing his palms rhythmically against her small chest, counting under his breath. 1, 2, 3, breathe. The room fell silent. Everyone watched, their eyes wide, as the man they had seen packing his things in humiliation just days earlier now fought to keep a child alive. The CEO knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered, clutching her daughter's hand. "Please save her." He didn't answer. His focus was entirely on the little girl. Each breath he gave, each compression he pressed, was fueled by the memory of his own losses, by the love he carried for his daughter, and by the simple human truth that no parent should have to watch their child slip away. Minutes passed, though, to the CEO, they felt like an eternity. And then, suddenly, the little girl coughed weakly, a faint but miraculous sound. Her chest rose as she drew in a shaky breath. "She's breathing," he said softly, relief washing over his face. The CEO let out a sob, pulling her daughter into her arms, holding her as if she would never let go again. Thank you," she cried, her voice breaking. Paramedics arrived shortly after, rushing the child to the hospital. The father stepped back, quietly allowing the professionals to take over. He stood there, exhausted, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands trembling now that the moment had passed. The CEO turned to him, her eyes red, her face pale. For a long moment, she couldn't find the words. This was the man she had fired, the man she had thought of as a threat, the man she had cast aside without hesitation. And yet, he was the one who had saved her daughter's life when no one else could. As the ambulance doors closed and the siren wailed into the night, she stood in the parking lot, staring at him. For the first time, her power, her pride, and her walls of confidence crumbled. She wasn't a CEO in that moment. She wasn't a woman guarding a secret. She was just a mother, humbled and shaken to her core. And the man before her, tired, dismissed, humiliated, had become the hero she owed everything to. The hospital corridor smelled faintly of antiseptic, its walls lined with white paint that seemed to stretch endlessly. The CEO sat in one of the plastic chairs outside the emergency room, her hands shaking as she twisted a tissue between her fingers. Inside, doctors worked on stabilizing her daughter. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Every sound of footsteps or the squeak of a cart made her heart jump. The father stood a little distance away, quiet and calm on the outside, though his chest still heaved from the adrenaline of what he had just done. He didn't want to intrude. He had come because he couldn't walk away, not when he had been the one who kept the girl alive until help arrived. Still, part of him wondered if he should leave. After all, this was the same woman who had thrown him out of her office, stripping him of his dignity and livelihood. But when he thought of the little girl lying behind those doors, he stayed. Minutes turned into an hour before the doctor finally stepped out, pulling down his mask. "She's stable now," he said gently. "We managed to control the situation. She'll need some rest and observation, but she's going to be all right." The CEO closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. Relief washed over her like a wave. She quickly stood and thanked the doctor before rushing into the room where her daughter lay. The girl was hooked up to machines, her breathing steady but shallow. Her small hand rested on the blanket, and the CEO held it tightly, pressing it against her cheek. "You're safe now, my darling," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You scared me so much." From the doorway, the father watched quietly. The scene brought back memories of his own past, nights spent in hospital rooms, holding the hand of his late wife before she slipped away. His chest ached with the familiar sting of loss, but it also reminded him of why he had acted so quickly tonight. He knew too well what it felt like to almost lose someone you loved. He couldn't stand by and let another parent go through that if he had the power to help. The CEO noticed him standing there. For a moment, their eyes met. Hers were swollen with tears, no longer filled with cold authority, but with something softer, gratitude mixed with guilt. She wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Later, when her daughter had drifted into a gentle sleep, the CEO stepped out of the room. She walked toward him slowly, her heels clicking on the tile floor, though her usual confident stride was gone. She stopped a few feet away, her voice trembling as she spoke. "If it weren't for you, I would have lost her." He shook his head gently. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Any parent would have done the same." "No," she replied firmly, tears welling again. "Not everyone would have known what to do. Not everyone would have acted so quickly. I can't imagine what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Her voice cracked as she whispered, "You saved her life." He looked down for a moment, unsure how to respond. He wasn't a man who sought praise or recognition. He had only done what his heart told him to do. Still, her words weighed heavily. Just days ago, she had dismissed him as nothing more than a burden. Now, she was standing before him, humbled and shaken. As the night went on, word spread through the hospital. Staff whispered about the single father who had saved the CEO's daughter. Some of the company employees who had attended the event began sending messages, sharing the story among themselves. By morning, the tale had reached corners of the city, far beyond the hospital walls. But he didn't care about the whispers or the attention. He sat in the waiting area, sipping a cup of bitter coffee from the vending machine, thinking about his own daughter. He couldn't wait to get home to her, to hold her close, and remind himself why he kept going. The CEO, meanwhile, couldn't shake the weight of guilt pressing against her heart. She remembered the look on his face in her office when she told him he was being fired. She remembered how he held back his anger, how he quietly picked up his things and walked away with dignity. And now, that same man had been the reason her daughter's heart still beat. When the morning sun filtered through the hospital windows, she finally gathered the courage to sit beside him in the waiting room. She cleared her throat softly. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," she said, her voice low. He glanced at her, his eyes calm. You don't owe me anything. I just did what needed to be done." "But I was wrong," she admitted, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I misjudged you. I thought you were a weakness, a risk to the company. I didn't see the strength it takes to be who you are. I didn't see the kind of man you are." For a moment, silence lingered between them. Then he said quietly, "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after them." Her eyes stung with tears again. She had spent her life building walls around herself, hiding her past, believing power was the only way to survive. But in this single father, she saw something she hadn't seen in years: selflessness, resilience, and love stronger than fear. Before leaving the hospital later that day, she asked him to wait. "Please," she said, her voice earnest. "Come back to the company. Let me make this right." He hesitated. The thought of stepping back into the same place where he had been humiliated didn't sit easily with him. But then he thought of his daughter, of the steady income he needed to provide for her future. Slowly he nodded. "Not for me," he said, "but for her." The CEO lowered her head, humbled by his words. She realized that what she had considered weakness, the love of a father for his child, was in fact the greatest strength she had ever witnessed. As they left the hospital, each carrying their own thoughts, one thing had become clear. The man she had once dismissed as a liability had become her unexpected hero. And though their paths had crossed under painful circumstances, both their lives had changed forever that night. Days passed after the incident at the hospital, but the memory of that night stayed fresh in both of their minds. The CEO had returned to her office, but she was no longer the same woman who had stood on stage with confidence and pride. Something inside her had shifted. Every time she saw her daughter smile or hold her hand, she was reminded that her world had almost fallen apart, and that it was the man she had wronged who had saved her child. She sat at her desk one morning, staring at the skyline outside her office window. The city still moved with its usual energy, but she couldn't shake the thoughts running through her mind. For years, she had convinced herself that power and control were the keys to survival. She had hidden her past mistakes under layers of authority, never allowing anyone to see her vulnerability. Yet, in her moment of greatest weakness, it wasn't her wealth, her power, or her reputation that saved her. It was a man she had treated unfairly, a single father who had nothing but his love for his child to guide him. That realization humbled her in a way nothing else ever had. Meanwhile, the father had gone back to his routine as best as he could. He still woke up early, still packed his daughter's school lunch, still walked her to school before searching for jobs that could help him pay the bills. Even though the CEO had asked him to return to the company, he hadn't rushed back. He wanted time to think, to decide whether it was the right thing for him and his daughter. He wasn't a man who held grudges, but he wasn't naive either. He knew what it felt like to be cast aside, and he didn't want to put himself back in a place where he was seen as less than human. Still, part of him wondered if going back could mean a better future for his little girl. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table helping her with her homework, she looked up at him with her wide, innocent eyes. "Pop, are you okay?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly. "Why do you ask?" "Because you look tired," she replied. "You always look tired. I just want you to be happy." His chest tightened at her words. He reached over and smoothed her hair. "As long as I have you, I'm happy," he said. And he meant it. Still, he knew he needed to give her more than just words. She deserved stability, security, and opportunities he couldn't provide if he kept struggling like this. The next day, he received a call from the CEO's office. It wasn't her assistant this time. It was her. Her voice sounded different, softer, almost nervous. "I'd like to meet with you," she said. "Not about work, not about the company. Just as two people." Curious, he agreed. They met at a small cafe away from the busy city center. She arrived without her usual sharp suit and intimidating presence. She looked like an ordinary woman, carrying the weight of her choices on her shoulders. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly as they sat across from each other. For a long moment, she didn't know where to start. Then she took a deep breath. "I want to apologize. Not just for firing you, but for the way I saw you. I looked at you and only saw problems. I didn't see the sacrifices, the strength, the love that keeps you moving. I was wrong." He listened, his hands folded on the table. "I wasn't looking for an apology," he said calmly. "I know," she replied. "But I needed to give one. Because that night, when I thought I was going to lose my daughter, I realized something. All the power in the world means nothing if you don't have love. And I saw that love in you. The way you risked everything for a child who wasn't even yours. It showed me what real strength looks like." He looked down for a moment, then said softly, "I only did what I hoped someone else would do if it was my daughter." The cafe was quiet around them, the clinking of cups and murmurs of other customers filling the silence. She leaned forward, her eyes earnest. "I want to make things right. Not just by offering your job back, but by truly respecting what you bring, not just as an employee, but as a person." He thought about her words. Part of him still carried the sting of humiliation, but he also saw the sincerity in her face. And deep down, he knew his daughter's future depended on the choices he made now. Slowly he nodded. "I'll come back," he said. "But not because I need your charity. I'll come back because I still have something to give. And because my daughter deserves a better tomorrow." Relief washed over her face. For the first time, she smiled, not the polished, public smile of a CEO, but the genuine smile of a mother who had learned a painful but important lesson. Weeks later, the company welcomed him back. This time, things felt different. The CEO treated him with respect, her attitude toward him and others softening in ways the employees noticed. She had been changed by the experience, humbled by the reality that even the strongest leaders needed help sometimes, and that true strength often came from love, not power. As for him, life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became steadier. He continued to work hard, balancing his job and his role as a father. His daughter noticed the change too. One evening, as they walked home together, she squeezed his hand and said, "Papa, you smile more now." He chuckled softly. "Do I?" "Yes," she said confidently. "And I like it." He looked at her and felt his heart swell. For all the hardships he had faced, for all the nights of worry and the mornings of exhaustion, moments like this reminded him it was all worth it. And somewhere in her tall office, the CEO often thought about that night, about the man she had once dismissed, and about the way he had saved her daughter's life. She no longer saw him as a liability, but as the quiet reminder that humanity and compassion mattered more than any profit or power. In the end, it wasn't the CEO's authority or the father's struggle that defined the story. It was the simple truth that sometimes the people we underestimate the most turn out to be the ones who save us when we need it most.